1830 to 1901. 1832, 1837, 15846, 1550, 15851, 1559, 1870-71, 1901. The first Reform Bill. Victoria becomes Queen. The Corn Laws repealed. Tennyson succeeds Wordsworth as Poet Laureate. The Great Exhibition in London. Charles Darwin's Onion of Species published. Franco-Prussian War. Death of Victoria. In 1897 Mark Twain was visiting London during the Diamond Jubilee sealed Bratians honoring the 60th anniversary of Queen Victoria's coming to the throne. British history is 2,000 years old, Twain observed, and yet in a good many ways the world has moved farther ahead since the Queen was born than it moved in all the rest of the 2,000 put together. And if the whole world had moved during that long lifetime and reign of Victoria's, it was in her own country itself that the change was most marked and dramatic, a change that brought England to its highest point of development as a world power. In the 18th century the pivotal city of Western civilization had been Paris. By the second half of the 19th century the center of influence had shifted to London, a city that expanded from about 2 million inhabitants when Victoria came to the throne to 6.5 million at the time of her death. The rapid growth of London is one of the many indications of the most important development of the age, the shift from a way of life based on the ownership of land to a modern urban economy based on trade and manufacturing. We have been living, as it were, the life of 300 years in 30 was the impression formed by Dr. Thomas Arnold during the early stages of England's industrialization. By the end of the century, after the resources of steam power had been more fully exploited for fast railways and iron ships, looms, printing presses, and farmers' combines, and after the introduction of the telegraph, intercontinental cable, photography, anesthetics, and universal compulsory education, a late Victorian could look back with astonishment on these developments during his or her lifetime. Walter Besant, one of these late Victorians, observed that so completely transformed were the mind and habits of the ordinary Englishman by 1897, that he would not, could he see him, recognize his own grandfather. Because England was the first country to become industrialized, its transformation was an especially painful one. It experienced a host of social and economic problems consequent to rapid and unregulated industrialization. England also experienced an enormous increase in wealth. An early start enabled England to capture markets all over the globe. Cotton and other manufactured products were exported in English ships, a merchant fleet whose size was without parallel in other countries. The profits gained from trade led also to extensive capital investments in all continents. After England had become the world's workshop, London became, from 1870 on, the world's banker. England gained particular profit from the development of its own colonies, which, by 1890, comprised more than a quarter of all the territory on the surface of the earth. 1 in 4 people was a subject of Queen Victoria. By the end of the century England was the world's foremost imperial power. The reactions of Victorian writers to the fast-paced expansion of England were various. Thomas Babington Macaulay, 1800 to 1859, relished the spectacle with strenuous enthusiasm. During the prosperous 1850s Macaulay's essays and histories, with their recitations of the statistics of industrial growth, constituted a hymn to progress as well as a celebration of the superior qualities of the English people, the greatest and most highly civilized people that ever the world saw. Other writers felt that leadership in commerce and industry was being paid for at a terrible price in human happiness, that a so-called progress had been gained only by abandoning traditional rhythms of life and traditional patterns of human relationships. The melancholy poetry of Matthew Arnold often strikes this note. For what wears out the life of mortal men? 'Tis that from change to change there being rolls, 'tis that repeated shocks, again, exhaust the energy of strongest souls. Although many Victorians shared a sense of satisfaction in the industrial and political preeminence of England during the period, they also suffered from an anxious sense of something lost, a sense too of being displaced persons in a world made alien by technological changes that had been exploited too quickly for the adaptive powers of the human psyche. Queen Victoria and the Victorian temper. Queen Victoria's long reign, from 1837 to 1901, defines the historical period that bears her name. The question naturally arises whether the distinctive character of those years justifies the adjective Victorian. In part Victoria herself encouraged her own identification with the qualities we associate with the adjective earnestness, moral responsibility, domestic propriety. As a young wife, as the mother of 9 children, and as the black-garbed widow of Windsor in the 40 years after her husband's death in 1861, Victoria represented the domestic fidelities her citizens embraced. After her death Henry James wrote, "I mourn the safe and motherly old middle-class queen, who held the nation warm under the fold of her big, hideous Scotch plaid shawl." Changes in the reproduction of visual images aided in making her the icon she became. She is the first British monarch of whom we have photographs. These pictures, and the ease and cheapness with which they were reproduced, facilitated her representing her country's sense of itself during her reign. Victoria came to the throne in a decade that does seem to mark a different historical consciousness among Britain's writers. In 1831 John Stuart Mill asserts, "We are living in an age of transition." In the same year Thomas Carlyle writes, "The old has passed away, but alas, the new appears not in its stead, the time is still in pangs of travail with the new." Although the historical changes that created the England of the 1630s had been in progress for many decades, writers of the 30s shared a sharp new sense of modernity, of a break with the past, of historical self-consciousness. They responded to their sense of the historical moment with a strenuous call to action that they self-consciously distinguished from the attitude of the previous generation. In 1834 Carlyle urged his contemporaries, "Close thy Byron, open thy Goethe." He was saying, in effect, to abandon the introspection of the Romantics and to turn to the higher moral purpose that he found in Goethe. The popular novelist Edward Rule written in his England and the Yorkshire, 1833, made a similar judgment. When Byron passed away, he wrote, "We turned to the actual and practical career of life, we awoke from the morbid, the dreaming, the moonlight and dimness of the mind, and by a natural reaction addressed ourselves to the active and daily objects which lay before us." This sense of historical self-consciousness, of strenuous social enterprise, and of growing national achievement led writers as early as the 1850s and 1860s to define their age as Victorian. The very fact that Victoria reigned for so long sustained the concept of a distinctive historical period that writers defined even as they lived it. When Queen Victoria died, a reaction developed against many of the achievements of the previous century. This reinforced the sense that the Victorian age was a distinct period. In the earlier decades of 20th century, writers took pains to separate themselves from the Victorians. It was then the fashion for most literary critics to treat their Victorian predecessors as some what absurd creatures, stuffily complacent pricks with whose way of life they had little in common. Writers of the Georgian period, 1911-36, took great delight in puncturing overinflated Victorian balloons, as Lytton Strachey, a member of Virginia Woolf's circle, did in Eminent Victorians, 1918. A subtler example occurs in Woolf's Orlando, 1928, a fictionalized survey of English literature from Elizabethan times to 1928, in which the Victorians are presented in terms of dampness, rain, and proliferating vegetation. Ivy grew in unparalleled profusion. Houses that had been of bare stone were smothered in greenery. And just as the ivy and the evergreen rioted in the damp earth outside, so did the same fertility show itself within. The life of the average woman was a succession of childbirths. Giant cauliflowers towered deck above deck till they rivaled the elm trees themselves. Hens laid incessantly eggs of no special tint. The whole sky itself as it spread wide above the British Isles was nothing but a vast feather bed. This witty description not only identifies a distinguishing quality of Victorian life and literature of superabundant energy but reveals the author's distaste for its smothering profusion. Woolf was the daughter of Sir Leslie Stephen, 1852-1904, an eminent Victorian. In her later life, when assessing her father's powerful personality, Woolf recorded in her diary that she could never have become a writer if he had not died when he did. Growing up under such towering shadows, she and her generation mocked their predecessors to make them less intimidating. In his reminiscences Portraits from Life, 1937, the novelist Ford Madox Ford recalled his feelings of terror when he confronted the works of Carlyle and Ruskin, which he likened to an overpowering range of high mountains. The mid-Victorians, he wrote, were a childish nightmare to me. The Georgian reaction against the Victorians is now only a matter of the history of taste, but its after-effects still sometimes crop up when the term Victorian is employed in an exclusively pejorative sense, as prudish or old-fashioned. Contemporary historians and critics find the Victorian period a richly complex example of a society struggling with the issues and problems we identify with modernism. Rather to give the period the single designation Victorian reduces its complexity. Since it is a period of almost 70 years, we can hardly expect generalizations to be uniformly applicable. It is, therefore, helpful to subdivide the age into three phases: Early Victorian, 1830 to 48, Mid-Victorian, 1848 to 70, and Late Victorian, 1870 to 1901. It is also helpful to consider the final decade, the 90s, as a bridge between two centuries. The early period, 1830 to 48, a time of troubles. In the early 1830s two historical events occurred of momentous consequence for England. In 1830 the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, becoming the first steam-powered, public railway line in the world. A burst of railway construction followed. By 1850 6,621 miles of railway line connected all of England's major cities. By 1900 England had 15,195 lines of track and an underground railway system beneath London. The train transformed England's landscape, supported the growth of its commerce, and shrank the distances between its cities. The opening of England's first railway coincided with the opening of the country's Reform Parliament. The railway had increased the pressure for parliamentary reform. Parliamentary reform must follow soon after the opening of this road, a Manchester man observed in 1830. A million of persons will pass over it in the course of this year, and see that hitherto unseen village of Newton, and they must be convinced of the absurdity of its sending 2 members to Parliament while Manchester sends none. Despite the growth of manufacturing cities consequent to the Industrial Revolution, England was still governed by an archaic electoral system whereby some of the new industrial cities were unrepresented in Parliament while rotten boroughs, communities that had become depopulated, elected the nominees of the local squire to Parliament. Re 1830, a time of economic distress had brought England close to revolution. Manufacturing interests, who refused to tolerate their exclusion from the political process any longer, led working men in agitating for reform. Fearing the kind of revolution it had seen in Europe, Parliament passed a reform bill in 1832 that transformed England's class structure. The Reform Bill of 1832 extended the right to vote to all males owning property worth £10 or more in annual rent. In effect the voting public thereafter included the lower middle classes but not the working classes, who did not obtain the vote until 1867. When a second reform bill was passed. Even more important than the extension of the franchise was the virtual abolition of the rotten boroughs and the redistribution of parliamentary representation. Because it broke up the monopoly of power that the conservative landowners had so long enjoyed, the Tory party had been in office almost continuously from 1783 to 1830, the Reform Bill represents the beginning of a new age, in which middle-class economic interests gained increasing power. Yet even the newly constituted parliament was unable to find legislative solutions to the problems facing the nation. The economic and social difficulties attendant on industrialization were so severe that the 1830s and 1840s became known as the time of troubles. After a period of prosperity from 1832 to 1836, a crash in 1837, followed by a series of bad harvests, produced a period of unemployment, desperate poverty, and rioting. Conditions in the new industrial and coal mining areas were terrible. Workers and their families in the slums of such cities as Manchester lived in horribly crowded, unsanitary housing, and the conditions under which men, women, and children toiled in mines and factories were unimaginably brutal. Elizabeth Barrett's poem The Cry of the Children, 1843, expresses her horrified response to an official report on child labor that described 5-year-olds sitting alone in darkness to open and close ventilation doors, and 12-year-olds dragging heavy tubs of coal through low-ceilinged mine passages for 16 hours a day. The owners of mines and factories regarded themselves as innocent of blame for such conditions, for they were wedded to an economic theory of laissez-faire, which assumed that unregulated working conditions would ultimately benefit everyone. A sense of the seemingly hopeless complexity of the situation during the Hungry 40s is provided by an entry for 1842 in the diary of the statesman Charles Greveley, an entry written at the same time that Carlyle was making his contribution to the condition of England question, past and present. Conditions in the north of England, Greveley reports, were appalling. There is an immense and continually increasing population, no adequate demand for labor, no confidence, but a universal alarm, disquietude, and discontent. Nobody can sell anything. Certainly I have never seen so serious a state of things as that which now stares us in the face, and this after 30 years of uninterrupted peace, and the most ample scope afforded for the development of all our resources. One remarkable feature in the present condition of affairs is that nobody can account for it, and nobody pretends to be able to point out any remedy. In reality many remedies were proposed. One of the most striking was put forward by the Chartists, a large organization of workers. In 1838 the organization drew up a people's charter advocating the extension of the right to vote, the use of secret balloting, and other legislative reforms. For 10 years the Chartist leaders engaged in agitation to have their program adopted by Parliament. Their fiery speeches, delivered at conventions designed to collect signatures for petitions to Parliament, created fears of revolution. In Locksley Hall, 1842, Alfred, Lord Tennyson seems to have had the Chartist demonstrations in mind when he wrote, "Slowly comes a hungry people, as a lion, creeping nigher, glares at one that nods and winks behind a slowly dying fire." Although the Chartist movement had fallen apart by 1848, it succeeded in creating an atmosphere open to reform. One of the most important reforms was the abolition of the high tariffs on imported grains, tariffs known as the Corn Laws. The word "com" in England refers to wheat and other grains. These high tariffs had been established to protect English farm products from having to compete with low-priced products imported from abroad. Landowners and farmers fought to keep these tariffs in force so that high prices for their wheat would be ensured, but the rest of the population suffered severely from the exorbitant price of bread or, in years of bad crops, from scarcity of food. In 1845, serious crop failures in England and the outbreak of potato blight in Ireland convinced Sir Robert Peel, the Tory Prime Minister, that traditional protectionism must be abandoned. In 1846 the Corn Laws were repealed by Parliament, and the way was paved for the introduction of a system of free trade whereby goods could be imported with the payment of only minimal tariff duties. Although free trade did not eradicate the slums of Manchester, it worked well for many years and helped relieve the major erisis of the Victorian economy. In 1848, when revolutions were breaking out all over Europe, England was relatively unaffected. A large Chartist demonstration in London seemed to threaten violence, but it came to nothing. The next 2 decades were relatively calm and prosperous. This time of troubles left its mark on some early Victorian literature. Insurrection I a most sad necessity, Carlyle writes in his Past and Present, and governors who wait for that to instruct them are surely getting into the fatalist courses. A similar refrain runs through Carlyle's History the French Retaliation, 1837. Memories of the French Reign of Terror lasted longer than memories of British victories over Napoleon at Trafalgar and Waterloo, memories freshened by later outbreaks of civil strife, the Red Fool fury oft sane as Tennyson described one of the violent overturnings of government in France. The most marked response to the industrial and political scene, however, comes in the condition of England novels of the 1840s and early 1850s. Vivid records of these times are to be found in the fiction of Charles Kingsley, 1819-1875, Elizabeth Gaskell, 1810-1865, and Benjamin Disraeli, 1804-1881, a novelist who became Prime Minister. For his novel Sybil, 1845, Disraeli chose an appropriate subtitle, The Two Nations, a phrase that pointed out the line dividing the England of rich from the other nation, the England of the poor. The mid-Victorian period, 1848-70, economic prosperity, the growth of empire, and religious controversy. In the decades following the time of trouble, some Victorian writers, such as Charles Dickens, continued to make critical attacks on the shortcomings of the Victorian social scene. Even more critical and indignant than Dickens was John Ruskin, who turned from a purely moral and aesthetic criticism of art during this period to denounce the evils of Victorian industry, as in his The Stones of Venice, 1851-53, which combines a history of architecture with stern prophecies about the doom of technological culture, or in his attacks on laissez-faire economics in Unto This Last, 1862. Generally speaking, however, the realistic novels of Anthony Trollope, 1815-1882, with their comfortable tolerance and equanimity, are a more characteristic reflection of the mid-Victorian attitude toward the social and political scene than are Ruskin's Lamentations. Overall, this second phase of the Victorian period had many harassing problems, but it was a time of prosperity. On the whole, its institutions worked well. Even the badly bungled war against Russia in the Crimea, 1854-56, did not seriously affect the growing sense of satisfaction that the challenging difficulties of the 1840s had been solved or would be solved by English wisdom and energy. The monarchy was proving its worth in a modern setting. The Queen and her husband, Prince Albert, were models of middle-class domesticity and devotion to duty. The aristocracy was discovering that free trade was enriching rather than impoverishing their estates. Agriculture flourished together with trade and industry. And through a succession of factory acts in Parliament, which restricted child labor and limited hours of employment, the condition of the working classes was also being gradually improved. When we speak of Victorian complacency or stability or optimism, we are usually referring to this mid-Victorian phase, the age of improvement, as the historian Asa Briggs has called it. Of all the decades in our history, writes G. M. Young, a wise man would choose the 1850s to be young in. In 1851 Prince Albert opened the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, where a gigantic glass greenhouse, the Crystal Palace, had been erected to display the exhibits of modern industry and science. The Crystal Palace was one of the first buildings constructed according to modern architectural principles in which materials such as glass and iron are employed for purely functional ends, much late Victorian furniture, on the other hand, with its fantastic and irrelevant ornamentation, was constructed according to the opposite principle. The building, as well as the exhibits, symbolized the triumphant feats of Victorian technology. As Benjamin Disraeli wrote to a friend in 1862, it is a privilege to live in this age of rapid and brilliant events. What an error to consider it a utilitarian age. It is one of infinite romance. England's technological progress, together with its prosperity, led to an enormous expansion of its influence around the globe. Its annual export of goods nearly trebled in value between 1850 and 1870. Not only the export of goods but that of people and capital increased. Between 1853 and 1882 2,466,000 emigrants left Britain, many bound for British colonies. By 1870 British capitalists had invested £800 million abroad, in 1850 the total had been only £300 million. This investment, of people, money, and technology, created the British Empire. Important building blocks of the empire were put in place in the mid-Victorian period. In the 1850s and 1860s there was large-scale immigration to Australia. In 1867 Parliament unified the Canadian provinces into the Dominion of Canada. In 1857 Parliament took over the government of India from the private East India Company, which had controlled the country, and started to put in place its civil service government. In 1876 Queen Victoria was named Empress of India. Although the competitive scramble for African colonies did not take place until the final decades of the century, the model of empire was created earlier, made possible by technological revolution in communication and transportation. Much as Rome had built roads through Europe in the years of the Roman Empire, Britain built railways and strung telegraph wires. It also put in place a framework for education and government that preserves British influence in former colonies even today. Britain's motives, in creating its empire, were many. It sought wealth, markets for manufactured goods, sources for raw materials, and world power and influence. Many English people also saw the expansion of empire as a moral responsibility, what Rudyard Kipling, in another context, termed the white man's burden. Queen Victoria stated that the imperial mission was to protect the poor natives and advance civilization. Missionary societies flourished, spreading Christianity in India, Asia, and Africa. At the same time that the British missionary enterprise was expanding, there was increasing debate about religious belief. By the mid-Victorian/period, the Church of England had evolved into three major divisions: evangelical, or low church, broad church, and high church. The evangelicals emphasized spiritual transformation of the individual by conversion and a strictly moral Christian life. Zealously dedicated to good causes, they were responsible for the emancipation of all slaves in the British Empire as early as 1833, advocates of a strict Puritan code of morality, and righteously censorious of worldliness in others. The evangelicals became a powerful and active minority in the early part of the 19th century. Much of the power of the evangelicals depended on the fact that their view of life and religion was virtually identical with that of a much larger group external to the Church of England, the nonconformists, or dissenters, that is, Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, and other Protestant denominations. The High Church was also associated with a group external to the Church of England. It was the Catholic side of the Church, emphasizing the importance of tradition, ritual, and authority. In the 1830s, a High Church movement took shape, known both as the Oxford Movement, because it originated at Oxford University, and as Tractarianism, because its leaders developed their arguments in a series of pamphlets or tracts. Led by John Henry Newman, who later converted to Roman Catholicism, Tractarians argued that the Church could maintain its power and authority only by resisting liberal tendencies and holding to its original traditions. The Broad Church resisted the doctrinal and ecclesiastical controversies that separated the High Church and evangelical divisions. Open to modern advances in thought, its adherents emphasized the broadly inclusive nature of the Church. Some rationalist challenges to religious belief that developed before the Victorian period maintained their influence. The most significant was utilitarianism, also known as Benthamism or philosophical radicalism. Utilitarianism derived from the thought of Jeremy Bentham, 1748-1832, and his disciple James Mill, 1773-1836, the father of John Stuart Mill. Bentham believed that all human beings seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. The criterion by which we should judge a morally correct action, therefore, is the extent to which it provides the greatest pleasure to the greatest number. Measuring religion by this moral arithmetic, Benthamites concluded that it was an outmoded superstition. It did not meet the rationalist test of value. Utilitarianism was widely influential in providing a philosophical basis for political and social reforms, but it aroused considerable opposition on the part of those who felt it failed to recognize people's spiritual needs. Raised according to strict utilitarian principles by his father, John Stuart Mill came to be critical of them. In the mental and spiritual crisis portrayed in his autobiography, 1873, Mill describes his realization that his utilitarian upbringing had left him no power to feel. In Sartor Resartus, 1833-34, Carlyle describes a similar spiritual crisis in which he struggles to rediscover the springs of religious feeling in the face of his despair at the specter of a universe governed only by utilitarian principles. Later, both Dickens, in his portrayal of Thomas Gradgrind in Hard Times, 1854, a man of facts and calculations who is ready to weigh and measure any parcel of human nature, and Ruskin, in his Unto This Last, attack utilitarianism. In mid-Victorian England, however, the challenge to religious belief gradually shifted from the utilitarians to some of the leaders of science, in particular to Thomas Henry Huxley, who popularized the theories of Charles Darwin. Although many English scientists were themselves individuals of strong religious convictions, the impact of their scientific discoveries seemed consistently damaging to established faiths. Complaining in 1851 about the flimsiness of his own religious faith, Ruskin exclaimed, "If only the geologists would let me alone, I could do very well, but those dreadful hammers. I hear the clink of them at the end of every cadence of the Bible verses." The damage lamented by Ruskin was effected in two ways. First, the scientific attitude of mind was applied toward a study of the Bible. This kind of investigation, developed especially in Germany, was known as the higher criticism. Instead of treating the Bible as a sacredly infallible document, scientifically minded scholars examined it as a mere text of history and presented evidence about its composition that believers, especially in Protestant countries, found disconcerting, to say the least. A noteworthy example of such higher criticism studies was David Friedrich Strauss's Das Leben Jesu, which was translated by George Eliot in 1846 as The Life of Jesus. The second kind of damage was effected by the view of humanity implicit in the discoveries of geology and astronomy, the new and terrible muses of literature, as Tennyson called them in a late poem. Geology, by extending the history of the Earth backward millions of years, reduced the stature of the human species in time. John Tyndall, an eminent physicist, said in an address at Belfast in 1874 that in the 18th century people had an unwavering trust in the chronology of the Old Testament, but in Victorian times they had to become accused home to the idea that not for 6,000, nor for 60,000, nor for 6,000,000, but for eons embracing untold millions of years, this earth has been the theater of life and death. The riddle of the rocks has been read by the geologist and paleontologist, from subcambrian depths to the deposits thickening over the sea bottoms of today. And upon the leaves of that stone bookery stamped the characters, plainer and surer than those formed by the ink of history, which carry the mind back into abysses of past time. The discoveries of astronomers, by extending a knowledge of stellar distances to dizzying expanses, were likewise disconcerting. Carlyle's friend John Sterling remarked in a letter of 1837 how geology gives one the same sort of bewildering view of the abysmal extent of time that astronomy does of space. To Tennyson's speaker in Maud, 1855, the stars are innumerable tyrants of iron skies. They are cold fires, yet with power to burn and brand slash his nothingness into man. In the mid-Victorian period biology reduced humankind even further into nothingness. Darwin's great treatise The Onion of Species, 1859, was interpreted by the non-scientific public in a variety of ways. Some chose to assume that evolution was synonymous with progress, but most readers recognized that Darwin's theory of natural selection conflicted not only with the concept of creation derived from the Bible but also with long-established assumptions of the values attached to humanity's special role in the world. Darwin's later treatise The Descent of Man, 1871, raised more explicitly the haunting question of our identification with the animal kingdom. If the principle of survival of the fittest was accepted as the key to conduct, there remained the inquiry, fittest for what? As John Fowles writes in his 1968 novel about Victorian England, The French Lieutenant's Woman, Darwin's theories made the Victorians feel infinitely isolated. By the 1860s, the great iron structures of their philosophies, religions, and social stratifications were already beginning to look dangerously corroded to the more perspicacious. Disputes about evolutionary science, like the disputes about religion, are a reminder that beneath the placidly prosperous surface of the mid-Victorian age there were serious conflicts and anxieties. In the same year as the Great Exhibition, with its celebration of the triumphs of trade and industry, Charles Kingsley wrote, "The young men and women of our day are fast parting from their parents and each other. The more thoughtful are wandering either towards Rome, towards sheer materialism, or towards an unchristian and unphilosophic spiritualism." The late period, 1870 to 1901 decay of Victorian values. The third phase of the Victorian age is more difficult to categorize. At first glance its point of view seems merely an extension of mid-Victorianism, whose golden glow lingered on through the Jubilee years of 1887 and 1897, years celebrating the 50th and 60th anniversaries of the Queen's accession, down to 1914. For many affluent Victorians, this final phase of the century was a time of serenity and security, the age of house parties and long weekends in the country. In the amber of Henry James's prose is immortalized a sense of the comfortable pace of these pleasant, food-filled gatherings. Life in London, too, was for many an exhilarating heyday. In My Life and Loves the Irish-American Frank Harris, 1854-1931, often a severe critic of the English scene, records his recollections of the gaiety of London in the 1880s. London, who would give even an idea of its varied delights. London, the center of civilization, the queen city of the world without a peer in the multitude of its attractions, as superior to Paris as Paris is to New York. The exhilarating sense of London's delights reflects in part the proliferation of things, commodities, inventions, products that were changing the texture of modern life. England had become committed not only to continuing technological change but also to a culture of consumerism, generating new products for sale. The wealth of England's empire provided the foundation on which its economy was built. The final decades of the century saw the apex of British imperialism, yet the cost of the empire became increasingly apparent in rebellions, massacres, and bungled wars, such as the Indian Mutiny in 1857, the Jamaica Rebellion in 1865, the massacre of General Gordon and his troops at Khartoum, in the Sudan, in 1885, where he had been sent to evacuate the British in the face of a religiously inspired revolt, and the Anglo-Boer War, at the end of the century, in which England engaged in a long, bloody, and unpopular struggle to annex two independent republics in the south of Africa controlled by Dutch settlers called Boers. In addition, the Irish question, as it was called, became especially divisive in the 1880s, when Home Rule for Ireland became a topic of heated debate, a proposed reform that was unsuccessfully advocated by Prime Minister Gladstone and other leaders. And outside the British Empire, other developments challenged Victorian stability and SECU writing. The sudden emergence of Bismarck's Germany after the defeat of France in 1871 was progressively to confront England with powerful threats to its naval and military position and also to its preeminence in trade and industry. The recovery of the United States after the Civil War likewise provided new and serious competition not only in industry but also in agriculture. As the westward expansion of railroads in the United States and Canada opened up the vast, grain-rich prairies, the typical English farmer had to confront lower grain prices and a dramatically different scale of productivity, which England could not match. In 1873 and 1874 such severe economic depressions occurred that the rate of emigration rose to an alarming degree. Another change in the mid-Victorian balance of power was the growth of labor as a political and economic force. In 1867, under Disraeli's guidance, a second reform bill had been passed that extended the right to vote to sections of the working classes, and this, together with the subsequent development of trade unions, made labor a powerful political force that included a wide variety of kinds of socialism. Some labor leaders were disciples of the Tory socialism of John Ruskin and shared his idealistic conviction that the middle-class economic and political system, with its distrust of state interference, was irresponsible and immoral. Other labor leaders had been influenced instead by the revolutionary theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as expounded in their Communist Manifesto of 1847 and in Marx's Das Kapital, 1867, 1885. 1895, the first English author of note to embrace Marxism was the poet and painter William Morris, who shared with Marx a conviction that utopia could be achieved only after the working classes had, by revolution, taken control of government and industry. In much of the literature of this final phase of Victorianism we can sense an overall change of attitudes. Some of the late Victorian writers expressed the change openly by simply attacking the major mid-Victorian idols. Samuel Butler, for example, said about demolishing Darwin, Tennyson, and Prime Minister Gladstone, figures whose aura of authority reminded him of his own tather. For the more worldly and casual-mannered Prime Minister Disraeli, on the other hand, Butler could express considerable admiration. Earnestness was his greatest danger, but if he did not quite overcome it, as who indeed can? It is the last enemy that shall be subdued, he managed to veil it with a fair amount of success. In his novel The Way of All Flesh, 1903, much of which was written in the 1870s, Butler satirized family life, in particular the tyrannical self-righteousness of a Victorian father, his own father, a clergyman, serving as his model. In a different vein Walter Pater and his followers concluded that the striving of their predecessors was ultimately pointless, that the answers to our problems are not to be found, and that our role is to enjoy the fleeting moments of beauty in this short day of frost and Sunday. It is symptomatic of this shift in point of view that Edward Fitzgerald's beautiful translation, 1859, of the Ruhaiyat of Omar Khayyam, with its melancholy theme that life's problems are insoluble, went virtually unnoticed in the 1860s but became a popular favorite in subsequent decades. The 90s. The changes in attitude that had begun cropping up in the 1870s became much more conspicuous in the final decade of the century and give the Nine Ties a special aura of notoriety. Of course the changes were not in evidence everywhere. At the empire's outposts in India and Africa, the English were building railways and administering governments with the same strenuous energy as in the mid-Victorian period. The stories of Kipling and Joseph Conrad variously record the struggles of such people. Also embodying the task of sustaining an empire were the soldiers and sailors who fought in various coal Nile wars, most notably in the war against the Boers in South Africa, 1899-1902. But back in England, Victorian standards were breaking down on several fronts. One colorful embodiment of changing values was Victoria's son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, who was entering his 50th year as the 90s began. A pleasure-seeking easygoing person, Edward was the antithesis of his father, Prince Albert, an earnest-minded intellectual who had devoted his life to hard work and to administrative responsibilities. Edward's carryings-on were a favorite topic for newspaper articles, one of which noted how this father of 5 children openly maintained scandalous relations with ballet dancers and chorus singers. Much of the writing of the decade illustrates a breakdown of a different sort. Melancholy, not gaiety, is characteristic of its spirit. Artists of the Nine Ties, representing the aesthetic movement, were very much aware of living at the end of a great century and often cultivated a deliberately fin de siècle, end of century, pose. A studied languor, a weary sophistication, a search for new ways of titillating jaded palates can be found in both the poetry and the prose of the period. The Yellow Book, a periodical that ran from 1894 to 1897, is generally taken to represent the aestheticism of the 90s. The startling black and white drawings and designs of its art editor, Aubrey Beardsley, the prose of George Moore and Max Beerbohm, and the poetry of Ernest Dowson illustrate different aspects of the movement. In 1893 the Austrian critic Max Nordau summed up what seemed to him to be happening, in a book that was as sensational as its title, Degeneration. From our perspective, however, it is easy to see in the 90s the beginning of the modernist movement in literature. A number of the great writers of the 20th century, Yeats, Hardy, Conrad, Shaw, were already publishing. In Dickens's Don Copperfield, 1850, the hero affirms, "I have always been thoroughly in earnest." 45 years later Oscar Wilde's comedy The Importance of Bang Ernest, 1895, turns the typical mid-Victorian word earnest into a pun, a key joke in this comic spectacle of earlier Victorian values being turned upside down. As Richard L. E. Gallion, a novelist of the 90s, remarked in the Romantic 90s, 1926, Wilde made dying Victorianism laugh at itself, and it may be said to have died of the laughter. The role of women. Political and legal reforms in the course of the Victorian period had given citizens many rights. In 1844 Friedrich Engels observed, "England is unquestionably the freest, that is the least unfree country in the world, North America not excepted." England had indeed done much to extend its citizens' liberties, but women did not share in these freedoms. They could not vote or hold political office. Although petitions to Parliament advocating women's suffrage were introduced as early as the 1840s, women did not get the vote until 1918. Until the passage of the Married Women's Property Acts, 1870-1908, married women could not own or handle their own property. While men could divorce their wives for adultery, wives could divorce their husbands only if adultery were combined with cruelty, bigamy, incest, or bestiality. Educational and employment opportunities for women were limited. These inequalities stimulated a spirited debate about women's roles known as the woman question. Some of the social changes that such discussion helped foster eventually affected the lives of all, or many, of the country's female population. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that this Victorian debate, despite the inclusive claims of its title, was, with a few exceptions, conducted by the middle classes about middle-class women. Arguments for women's rights were based on the same libertarian principles that had formed the basis of extended rights for men. In Hardy's last novel, Jude the Obscure, 1895, his heroine justifies leaving her husband by quoting a passage from Mill's On Liberty, 1859. She might have quoted another work by Mill, The Subjection of Women, 1869, which, like Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, challenges long-established assumptions about women's role in society. Legislative measures over the course of the 19th century gradually brought about changes in a number of areas. The Custody Act of 1839 gave a mother the right to petition the court for access to her minor children and custody of children under 7, raised to 16 in 1878. The Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 established a civil divorce court. Divorce previously could be granted only by an ecclesiastical court, and provided a deserted wife the right to apply for a protection order that would allow her rights to her property. Although divorce remained so expensive as to be available only to the very rich, these changes in marriage and divorce laws, together with the Married Women's Property Acts, began to establish a basis for the rights of women in marriage. In addition to pressuring Parliament for legal reform, feminists worked to enlarge female educational opportunities. In 1837 none of England's 3 universities was open to women. Tennyson's long poem The Princess, 1847, with its fantasy of a women's college from whose precincts all males are excluded, was inspired by contemporary discussions of the need for women to obtain an education more advanced than that provided by the popular finishing schools such as Miss Pinkerton's Academy in William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, 1847-48. Although by the end of the poem Princess Ida has repented of her Amazonian scheme, she and the prince look forward to a future in which man will be more of woman, she of man. The poem reflects a climate of opinion that led in 1848 to the establishment of the first women's college in London, an example later recommended by Thomas Henry Huxley, a strong advocate of advanced education for women. By the end of Victoria's reign, women could take degrees at 12 universities or university colleges and could study, although not earn a degree, at Oxford and Cambridge. There was also agitation for improved employment opportunities for women. Writers as diverse as Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Florence Nightingale complained that middle-class women were taught trivial accomplishments to fill up days in which there was nothing important to do. Had they been aware of such complaints, women from the majority lower-class population might have found it hard to show sympathy. The working lives of poor English women had always been strenuous, inside and outside the house, but industrial society brought unprecedented pressures. Although the largest proportion of working women labored as servants in the homes of the more affluent, the explosive growth of mechanized industries, especially in the textile trade, created new and grueling forms of paid employment. Hundreds of thousands of lower-class women worked at factory jobs under appalling conditions, while the need for coal to fuel England's industrial development brought women into the mines for the first time. A series of Factory Acts, 1802-78, gradually regulated the conditions of labor in mines and factories, eventually reducing the 16-hour day and banning women from mine work altogether. But even with such changes, the lot of the country's poorest women, whether factory operatives or housemaids, seamstresses, or field laborers, was undoubtedly hard. Bad working conditions and underemployment drove thousands of women into prostitution, which in the 19th century became increasingly professionalized and the subject of an almost obsessive public concern, whose manifestations included frequent literary and artistic representation. For the most part, prostitution was a trade for working-class women, but there was considerable anxiety about the possible fates of what contemporary journalists called the surplus or redundant women of the middle classes, that is, women who remained unmarried because of the imbalance in numbers between the sexes. Such women, of whom there were approximately 500,000 in mid-Victorian England, had few employment opportunities, none of them attractive or profitable. Emigration was frequently proposed as a solution to the problem, but the number of single female emigrants was never high enough to significantly affect the population imbalance. The only occupation at which an unmarried middle-class woman could earn a living and maintain some claim to gentility was that of a governess, but a governess could expect no security of employment, only minimal wages, and an ambiguous status, somewhere between servant and family member, that isolated her within the household. Perhaps because the governess so clearly indicated the precariousness of the unmarried middle-class woman's status in Victorian England, the governess novel, of which the most famous examples are Jane Eyre, 1847, and Vanity Fair, became a popular genre through which to explore women's roles in society. As such novels indicate, Victorian society was preoccupied not only with legal and economic limitations on women's lives but with the very nature of woman. In The Subjection of Women, John Stuart Mill argues that what is now called the nature of women is eminently an artificial thing, the result of forced repression in some directions, unnatural stimulation in others. In 10. Nisson's The Princess the King voices a more traditional view of male and female roles, a view that has come to be known as the doctrine of separate spheres. Man for the field and woman for the hearth, man for the sword and for the needle she, man with the head and woman with the heart, man to command and woman to obey. The king's relegation of women to the hearth and heart reflects an ideology that claimed that woman had a special nature peculiarly fit for her domestic role. Most aptly epitomized by the title of Coventry Patmore's immensely popular poem The Angel in the House, 1854-62, this concept of womanhood stressed woman's purity and selflessness. Protected and enshrined within the home, her role was to create a place of peace where man could take refuge from the difficulties of modern life. In Of Queen's Gardens, 1865, John Ruskin writes, "This is the true nature of home. It is the place of peace, the shelter, not only from all injury, but from all terror, doubt, and division. In so far as it is not this, it is not home, so far as the anxieties of the outer life penetrate into it, and the inconsistently minded, unknown, unloved, or hostile society of the outer world is allowed either by husband or wife to cross the threshold, it ceases to be home. It is then only a part of that outer world which you have roofed over, and lighted fire in. But so far as it is a sacred place, a vestal temple, a temple of the hearth watched over by household gods, so far it vindicates the name, and fulfills the praise, of home." Such an exalted conception of home placed great pressure on the woman who ran it to be, in Ruskin's words, enduringly, incorruptibly good, instinctively, infallibly wise, not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. It is easy to recognize the oppressive aspects of this domestic ideology. Paradoxically, however, it was used not only by anti-feminists, eager to keep woman in her place, but by some feminists as well, in justifying the special contribution that woman could make to public life. In his preface to the Portrait of a Lady, 1881, Henry James writes, "Millions of presumptuous girls, intelligent or not intelligent, daily affront their destiny, and what is it open to their destiny to he, at the most, that we should make an ado about it?" Every major Victorian novelist makes the ado that James describes in addressing the question of woman's vocation. By the 1890s the new woman, an emerging form of emancipated womanhood, was endlessly debated in a wave of fiction and magazine articles. Ultimately, as Victorian texts illustrate, the basic problem was not only political, economic, and educational. It was how women were regarded, and regarded themselves, as members of a society. Literacy, publication, and reading. Literacy increased significantly during the Victorian period, although precise figures are difficult to calculate. In 1837 about half of the adult male population could read and write to some extent. By the end of the century, basic literacy was almost universal, the product in part of compulsory national education, required by 1880 to the age of 10. There was also an explosion of things to read. Because of technological changes in printing presses powered by steam, paper made from wood pulp rather than rags, and, toward the end of the century, typesetting machines, publishers could bring out more printed material more cheaply than ever before. The number of newspapers, periodicales, and books increased exponentially during the Victorian period. Books remained fairly expensive, and most readers borrowed them from commercial lending libraries. There were few public libraries until the final decades of the century. After the repeal of the stamp tax and duties on advertisements. Just after mid-century, an extensive popular press developed. The most significant development in publishing from the point of view of literary culture was the growth of the periodical. In the first 30 years of the Victorian period, 170 new periodicals were started in London alone. There were magazines for every taste, cheap and popular magazines that published sensational tales, religious monthlies, weekly newspapers, satiric periodicals noted for their political cartoons. The most famous of these was Punch, women's magazines, monthly miscellanies publishing fiction, poetry, and articles on current affairs, and reviews and quarterlies, ostensibly reviewing new books but using the reviews, which were always unsigned, as occasions for essays on the subjects in question. The chief reviews and monthly magazines had a great deal of power and influence. They defined issues in public affairs, and they made and broke literary reputations. They also published the major writers of the period, the fiction of Dickens, Thackeray, Eliot, Trawl, Lope, and Gaskell, the essays of Carlyle, Mill, Arnold, and Ruskin, and the poetry of Tennyson and the Brownings all appeared in monthly magazines. The circumstances of periodical publication exerted a shaping force on literature. Novels and long works of non-fiction prose were published in serial form. Although serial publication of works began in the late 18th century, it was the publication of Dickens's Pick and Papers, 1836-37, in individual numbers that established its popularity. All of Dickens's novels and many of those of his contemporaries were published in serial form. Readers therefore read these works in relatively short, discrete installments over a period that could extend more than a year, with time for reflection and interpretation in between. Serial publication encouraged a certain kind of plotting and pacing and allowed writers to take account of their readers' reactions as they constructed subsequent installments. Writers created a continuing world, punctuated by the ends of installments, which served to stimulate the curiosity that would keep readers buying subsequent issues. Serial publication also created a distinctive sense of a community of readers, a sense encouraged by the practice of reading aloud in family gatherings. As the family reading of novels suggests, the middle-class reading public enjoyed a common reading culture. Poets such as Tennyson and Elizabeth Barrett Browning and anthologies such as Palgrave's Golden Treasury, 1861, appealed to a large body of readers. Prose writers such as Carlyle, Arnold, and Ruskin achieved the status as sages, and the major Victorian novelists were popular writers. Readers shared the expectation that literature would not only delight but instruct, that it would be continuous with the lived world, and that it would illuminate social problems. Tennyson, one of his college friends, warned him, "We cannot live in art." These expectations weighed more heavily on some writers than others. Tennyson wore his public mantle with conceit. Arable ambivalence. Arnold abandoned the private mode of lyric poetry in order to speak about public issues in lectures and essays. By the 1870s, the sense of a broad readership, with a shared set of social concerns, had begun to dissolve. Writers had begun to define themselves in opposition to a general public. Poets like the Pre-Raphaelites pursued art for art's sake, doing exactly what Tennyson's friend had warned against. Mass publication included less and less serious literature. Re the end of Victoria's reign, writers could no longer assume a unified reading public. The novel. The novel was the dominant form in Victorian literature. Initially published, for the most part, in serial form, novels subsequently appeared in 3-volume editions, or three-deckers. Large loose baggy monsters, Henry James called them, reflecting his dissatisfaction with their sprawling panoramic expanse. As their size suggests, Victorian novels seek to represent a large and comprehensive social world, with the variety of classes and social settings that constitute a community. They contain a multitude of characters and a number of plots, setting in motion the kinds of patterns that reveal the author's vision of the deep structures of the social world. How, in George Eliot's words, the mysterious mixture behaves under the varying experiments of time. They present themselves as realistic, that is, as representing a social world that shares the features of the one we inhabit. The French novelist Stendhal, 1783-1842, called the novel a mirror wandering down a road, but the metaphor of the mirror is somewhat deceptive, since it implies that writers exert no shaping force on their material. It would be more accurate to speak not of realism but of realisms, since each novelist presents a specific vision of reality whose representational force he or she seeks to persuade us to acknowledge through a variety of techniques and conventions. The worlds of Dickens, of Trollope, of Eliot, of the Brontes hardly seem continuous with each other, but their authors share the attempt to convince us that the characters and events they imagine resemble those we experience in actual life. The experience that Victorian novelists most frequently depict is the set of social relationships in the middle-class society developing around them. It is a society where the material conditions of life indicate social position, where money defines opportunity, where social class enforces a powerful sense of stratification, yet where chances for class mobility exist. Pip can aspire to the great expectations that provide the title for Dickens's novel. Jane Eyre can marry her employer, a landed gentleman. Most Victorian novels focus on a protagonist whose effort to define his or her place in society is the main concern of the plot. The novel thus constructs a tension between surrounding social conditions and the aspiration of the hero or heroine, whether it be for love, social position, or a life adequate to his or her imagination. This tension makes the novel the natural form to use in portraying woman's struggle for self-realization in the context of the constraints imposed upon her. For both men and women writers, the heroine is often, therefore, the representative protagonist whose search for fulfillment emblematizes the human condition. The great heroines of Victorian fiction, Jane Eyre, Maggie Tulliver, Dorothea Brooke, Isabel Archer, Tess of the d'Urbervilles, even Becky Sharp, all seem in some way to illustrate George Eliot's judgment, voiced in the prelude to Middlemarch, 1871-72, of a certain spiritual grandeur ill-matched with meanness of opportunity. From the beginning of the 19th century, the novel was more than a fertile medium for the portrayal of women. Women writers were, for the first time, not figures on the margins but major authors. Jane Austen, the Brontes, Elizabeth Gaskell, George Eliot all helped define the genre. When Charlotte Bronte screwed up her courage to write to the poet laureate, Robert Southey, to ask his advice about a career as a writer, he warned her, "Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be." Charlotte Bronte put this letter, with one other from Southey, in an envelope, with the inscription "Southey's advice to be kept forever. My 21st birthday." Bronte's ability ultimately to depart from Southey's advice derived in part from how amenable the novel was to women writers. It concerned the domestic life that women knew well: courtship, family relationships, marriage. It was a popular form whose market women could enter easily. It did not carry the burden of an august tradition as poetry did, nor did it build on the learning of a university education. In his essay The Lady Novelists, 1852, George Henry Lewis declared, "The advent of female literature promises woman's view of life, woman's experience." His common-law wife, George Eliot, together with many of her sister novelists, fulfilled his prophecy. Whether written by women or men, the Victorian novel was extraordinarily various. It encompassed a wealth of styles and genres, from the extravagant comedy of Dickens to the Gothic romances of the Bronte sisters, from the satire of Thackeray to the probing psychological fiction of Eliot, from the social and political realism of Trollope to the sensation novels of Wilkie Collins. Later in the century, a number of popular genres developed: crime, mystery, and horror novels, as well as science fiction and detective stories. For the Victorians, the novel was both a principal form of entertainment and a spur to social sympathy. There was not a social topic that the novel did not address. Dickens, Gaskell, and many lesser novelists tried to stimulate efforts for social reform through their depiction of social problems. Writing at the beginning of the 20th century, Joseph Conrad defined a novel in a way that could speak for the Victorians. What is a novel if not a conviction of our fellow men's existence strong enough to take upon itself a form of imagined life clearer than reality, and whose accumulated verisimilitude of selected episodes puts to shame the pride of documentary history? Poetry. Victorian poetry developed in the context of the novel. As the novel emerged as the dominant form of literature, poets sought new ways of telling stories in verse. Examples include Tennyson's Maud, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, 1857, Robert Browning's The Ring and the Book, 1868-69, and Arthur Hugh Clough's Amours de Voyage, 1857-58. Poets and critics debated what the appropriate subjects of such long narrative poems should be. Some, like Matthew Arnold, held that poets should use the heroic materials of the past. Others, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, felt that poets should represent their age, not Charlemagne's. Poets also experimented with character and perspective. Amours de Voyage is a long epistolary poem that tells the story of a failed romance through letters written by its various characters. The Ring and the Book presents its plot, an old Italian murder story, through 10 different perspectives. Victorian poetry also developed in the shadow of Romanticism. By 1837, when Victoria ascended the throne, all the major Romantic poets, save William Wordsworth, were dead, but they had died young, and many readers consequently still regarded them as their contemporaries. Not even 20 years separated the birth dates of Tennyson and Browning from that of John Keats, but they lived more than 3 times as long as he did. All the Victorian poets show the strong influence of the Romantics, but they cannot sustain the confidence that the Romantics felt in the power of the imagination. The Victorians often rewrite romantic poems with a sense of belatedness and distance. When, in his poem Resignation, Arnold addresses his sister upon revisiting a landscape, much as Wordsworth had addressed his sister in Tintern Abbey, he tells her the rocks and sky seem to bear rather than rejoice. Tennyson frequently represents his muse as an empowered woman, cut off from the world and doomed to death. The speakers of Browning's poems who embrace the visions that their imaginations present are madmen. When Hardy writes The Darkling Thrush, in December 1900, Keats's nightingale has become an aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small. Victorian poets build upon this sense of belated romanticism in a number of different ways. Some poets writing in the second half of the century, like Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Algernon Charles Swinburne, embrace an attenuated romanticism, art pursued for its own sake. Reacting against what he sees as the insufficiency of an allegory of the state of one's own mind as the basis of poetry, Arnold seeks an objective basis for poetic emotion and finally gives up writing poems altogether when he decides that the present age lacks the culture necessary to support great poetry. The more fruitful reaction to the subjectivity of romantic poetry, however, was not Arnold's but Browning's. Turning from the mode of his early poetry, modeled on Percy Bysshe Shelley, Browning began writing dramatic monologues poems, he said, that are lyric in expression but dramatic in principle, and so many utterances of so many imaginary persons, not mine. Tennyson simultaneously developed a more lyric form of the dramatic monologue. The idea of creating a lyric poem in the voice of a speaker ironically distinct from the poet is the great achievement of Victorian poetry, one developed extensively in the 20th century. In Poetry and the Age, 1953, the modernist poet and critic Randall Jarrell acknowledges this fact: the dramatic monologue, which once had depended for its effect upon being a departure from the norm of poetry, now became in one form or other the norm. The formal experimentation of Victorian poetry, both in long narrative and in the dramatic monologue, may make it seem eclectic, but Victorian poetry shares a number of characteristics. It tends to be pictorial, using detail to construct visual images that represent the emotion or situation the poem concerns. In his review of Tennyson's first volume of poetry, Arthur Henry Hallam defines this kind of poetry as picturesque, as combining visual impressions in such a way that they create a picture that carries the dominant emotion of the poem. This aesthetic brings poets and painters close together. Contemporary artists frequently illustrated Victorian poems, and poems themselves often present paintings. Victorian poetry also uses sound in a distinctive way. Whether it be the mellifluousness of Tennyson or Swinburne, with its emphasis on beautiful cadences, alliteration, and vowel sounds, or the roughness of Browning or Gerard Manley Hopkins, a roughness adopted in part in reaction against Tennyson, the sound of Victorian poetry reflects an attempt to use poetry as a medium with a presence almost independent of sense. The result in style can become so syntactically elaborate that it is easy to parody, as in Hopkins's description of Browning as a man bouncing up from table with his mouth full of bread and cheese or T5. Eliot's criticism of Swinburne's poetry, where meaning is merely the hallucination of meaning. Yet it is important to recognize that these poets use sound to convey meaning, to quote Hallam's review of Tennyson once more, where words would not. The tone becomes the sign of the feeling. In all of these developments, the experimentation with narrative and perspective, the dramatic monologue, the use of visual detail and sound, Victorian poets seek to represent psychology in a different way. Their most distinctive achievement is a poetry of mood and character. They therefore sat in uneasy relationship to the public expectation that poets be sages with something to teach. Tennyson, Browning, and Arnold showed varying discomfort with this public role, poets beginning to write in the second half of the century distanced themselves from their public by embracing an identity as bohemian rebels. Women poets encountered a different set of difficulties in developing their poetic voice. When, in Barrett Browning's epic about the growth of a woman poet, Aurora Lee's cousin Romney discourages her poetic ambitions by telling her that women are weak for art but strong for life and duty, he articulates the prejudice of an age. Women poets view their vocation in the context of the constraints and expectations upon their sex. Perhaps because of this, their poems are less complicated by the experiments in perspective than those of their male contemporaries. Prose. Although Victorian poets felt ambivalent about the didactic mission the public expected of the man of letters, writers of non-fictional prose aimed specifically to instruct. Although the term non-fictional prose is clumsy and not quite exact, the Victorians themselves referred instead to history, biography, theology, criticism. It has its uses not only to distinguish these prose writers from the novelists but also to indicate the centrality of argument and persuasion to Victorian intellectual life. The growth of the periodical press, described earlier, provided the vehicle and marketplace for non-fictional prose. It reflects a vigorous sense of shared intellectual life and the public urgency of social and moral issues. On a wide range of controversial topics, religious, political, and aesthetic writers seek to convince their readers to share their convictions and values. Such writers seem at times almost secular priests. Indeed, in the fifth lecture of On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroi History, 1841. Carlyle defines the writer precisely in these terms: men of letters are a perpetual priesthood, from age to age, teaching all men that God is still present in their life. In the true literary man, there is thus ever, acknowledged or not by the world, a sacredness. The modern man of letters, Carlyle argues, differs from his earlier counterpart in that he writes for money. Never, till about 100 years ago, was there seen any figure of a great soul living apart in that anomalous manner, endeavoring to speak forth the inspiration that was in him by printed works, and find place and subsistence by what the world would please him for doing that. This combination, of a new market position for non-fictional writing and an exalted sense of the didactic function of the writer, produces a quintessential Victorian form. On behalf of non-fictional prose, Walter Pater argued in his essay Style, 1889, that it was the special and opportune art of the modern world. He believed not that it was superior to verse but that it more readily conveys the chaotic variety and complexity of modern life, the incalculable intellectual diversity of the master currents of the present time. Pater's characterization of prose helps us understand what its writers were attempting to do. Despite the diversity of styles and subjects, Victorian prose writers were engaged in shaping belief in a bewilderingly complex and changing world. Their modes of persuasion differ. Mill and Huxley rely on clear reasoning, logical argument, and the kind of lucid style favored by essayists of the 18th century. Carlyle and Ruskin write a prose that is more romantic in character, that seeks to move readers as well as convince them. Whatever the differences in their rhetorical techniques, however, they share an urgency of exposition. Not only by what they said but by how they said it, Victorian prose writers were claiming a place for literature in a scientific and materialistic culture. Arnold and Pater share this as an explicit aim. Each in his own way argues that culture, the intensely serious appreciation of great works of literature, provides the kind of immanence and meaning that people once found in religion. For Arnold this is an intensely moral experience, for Pater it is aesthetic. Together they develop the basis for the claims of modern literary criticism. Drama and theater. Though the Victorian age can lay claim to greatness for its poetry, its prose, and its novels, it would be difficult to make such a high claim for its plays, at least until the final decade of the century. Here we must distinguish between playwriting on the one hand and theatrical activity on the other. For the theater, throughout the period, was a flourishing and popular institution, in which were performed not merely conventional dramas but a rich variety of theatrical entertainments, many with lavish spectacular effects, burlesques, extravaganzas, highly scenic and altered versions of Shakespeare's plays, melodramas, pantomimes, and musicals. Robert Corrigan gives figures that suggest the extent of the popularity of such entertainment. In the decade between 1850 and 1860 the number of theaters built throughout the country was doubled, and in the middle of the 60s, in London alone, 150,000 would be attending the theater on any given day. Only when we realize that the theater was to Victorian England what television is to us today will we be able to comprehend both its wide appeal and its limited artistic achievement. The popularity of theatrical entertainment made theater a powerful influence on other genres. Dickens was devoted to the theater and composed many of the scenes of his novels with theatrical techniques. Thackeray represents himself as the puppet master of his characters in Vampty FMR and employs the stock gestures and expressions of melodramatic acting in his illustrations for the novel. Tennyson, Browning, and Henry James tried their hands at writing plays, though with no commercial success. Successful plays on stage were written by the lesser lights of literature such as Dion Boucicault, 1820-1890, the period's most prolific and popular dramatist. The comic operas of W.5. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan prove the exception to this judgment. Their satire of Victorian values and institutions, what Gilbert called their topside-erbitum, and their grave and quasi-respectful treatment of the ridiculous not only make them delightful in themselves but anticipate the techniques of Shaw and Wilde. Around 1890. When the socially controversial plays of the Norwegian dramatist Henrik Ibsen, 1828-1906, became known in England, Arthur Pinero, 1855-1934, and Bernard Shaw began writing problem plays, which addressed difficult social issues. In the 1890s Shaw and Oscar Wilde transformed British theatre with their comic masterpieces. Although they did not like each other's work, they both created a kind of comedy that took aim at Victorian pretense and hypocrisy. Texts. 1830 Alfred Lord Tennyson, Poems, Shidfly 1832 Agwai 1833. 1836 1837. Lyrical 5 Ir Charles Lyell, Principles of Geology. Thomas Carlyle, Surrey Research. Charles Dickens, Pickwick Papers Carlyle, The French Revolution. 1542 Tennyson, Poems. Robert Browning, Dramatic 1843. 1846. Lyrics John Ruskin, Modum Poetaris, Vol. 1. George Eliot, The Life of Jesus, Translation, 1847 Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights 1848 Elizabeth Gaskell, MMRY Barton, William Makepeace Thackeray, Vanity Fair. 1850 Tennyson, In Memoriam, William Wordsworth, The Prelude, posthumous publication, 1851. 1853 1854. 1855 1857 Let 1859. Ruskin, Stones of Venice. Matthew Arnold, Poems Dickens, Hard Times. Robert Browning, Men and Women Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Oram. Charles Darwin, The Origin of SPE Size. John Stuart Mill, On Liberty, Tennyson, Idols of the King, Books 1-4. 1860 Dickens, Great Expectations, Eliot, The Mill on the Floss. 1562 1564 Christina Rossetti, Goblin Market. Contexts. 1830 Opening of Liverpool and Manchester Railway 1832 First Reform Bill. 1833 Factory Act. Abolition of Slavery Act, beginning of Oxford Movement 1536 First train in London 1837 Victoria becomes Queen 1838 People's Charter issued by Chartist Movement 15840 Queen Mary's Prince Albert 1842 Chartist riots. Copyright Act. Muti Circulating Library. 1845-4060 Potato Famine in Ireland. Mass emigration to North America 1546 Repeal of Corn Laws. Robert Browning marries Elizabeth Barrett 1847 10 Hours Factory Act. 15848 Revolution on the Continent. Second Sun Republic established in France. Founding of Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood 1850 Tennyson succeeds Wordsworth as Poet Laureate. 1851 Great Exhibition of Science and Industry at the Crystal Palace. 1854 Crimean War. Florence Nightingale organizes nurses to care for sick and wounded. 1857 Indian Mutiny. Matrimonial Causes Act. 1860 Italian Unification. 1861 Death of Prince Albert. R. Browning, Diomedes Persuae. 1861-65 American Civil War. Texts. 1865 Lewis Carmichael, Alice is a Dove and Wees in Wonderland. Ballads 1866 Algernon Charles Swinburne, Poems, and 1867. 1869 1871. 1872 1873. Karl Marx, Das Kapital. Ameld, Culture and Anarchy. Mill, Subjection of Women. Darwin, Descent of Man. Eliot, Middlemarch Walter Pater, Studix in the History of the Renaissance. 1885 W5. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan, The Mikado 1886 Robert Louis Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Hyde 1888 Rudyard Kipling, Plain Tales from the Hills 1889. 1891. William Butler Yeats, Crossways. Thomas Hardy, Tess of the Delbert Mills. Bernard Shaw, The Cant Sense of Ibsemism. Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Arthur Conan Doyle, Adventures of Sherlock Holmes 1893-1895 Shaw, Mrs. Whitron's Profession Wilde, The Import Mice of Bednam Nest. Hardy, Jude the Obscure 1896 A. E. Houseman, A Shropshire Lad 1898. 1900. Hardy, Wessex Poems. Joseph Conrad, Loved Fim. Contexts. 1565 Jamaica Rebellion. 1867-1568 Second Reform Bill Opening of Suez Canal. 1870 Demarried Women's Property Act, Victorian Franco-Prussian War makes Germany a world power. Elementary Education Act 1871 Newnham College, first women's Oxbridge College, founded at Cambridge. 1877 Queen Victoria made Empress of India. Gerard Manley Hopkins joins Jesuit Order 1878 Electric street lighting in London 1882 Married Women's Property Act 1885 DM Massacre of General Gurdon and his forces and fall of Khartoum. 1891st subway line in London 1891. 1895. Free elementary education. Independent Labour Party Oscar Wilde arrested and Empress 1 for homosexuality. 1898-1899 Dublin. Discovery of Radium Irish Literary Theatre founded in 1899 to 1902 Anglo-Boer War. 1901 Death of Queen Victoria, succession of Edward VII.